The rifle came up before Eudora Dawson had time to think about whether she meant to use it, and the man standing beside the water barrels at the edge of her well went very still, both hands lifting slow into the gray September light. "I ought to shoot you where you stand, Robert Winslow," she said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands did just slightly, around the stock of her late husband's Winchester. "Sheriff Holt says you were seen on the Ridge Road the night Thomas died. Says you argued with him over the creek rights not 3 days before somebody put a bullet in him and left him in the wash." Robert did not lower his hands, but he did not step back either, and there was something in the way he held himself, patient as a man used to gentling spooked horses, that made her finger ease off the trigger even as her heart kept hammering. "Mrs. Dawson, I have not lied to you yet, and I am not about to start with a rifle pointed at my chest," he said. "I did argue with your husband. I will not pretend otherwise. But I argued with him about splitting the spring water fair between both our herds, and I left him alive and sour and cussing my name, same as he did most weeks that summer. I did not kill him. I have spent every night since his funeral hauling water to homesteads whose wells went dry, including yours, though you never once caught me at it until tonight." Eudora's eyes flicked to the 3 barrels lined against her fence post, barrels that had not been there the evening before, and something cold moved through her chest that had nothing to do with the rifle. She had noticed the water appearing for 2 weeks now, always overnight, always enough to keep her garden from dying and her 2 milk cows from bawling with thirst, and she had told herself some kindly neighbor was doing it. Perhaps old Amos Federley from down the valley, though Amos barely had water enough for his own stock. She had never once let herself think it might be a Winslow. "Why would you do that?" she said, "for a woman whose husband spent a year fighting you over creek rights? Because your husband is dead and you are carrying his homestead alone through the worst drought this valley has seen in a decade, and because whatever quarrel he and I had was between 2 stubborn men, not between you and me," Robert said. "I do not aim to let a woman and her land wither because of an argument over water that never should have turned to killing in the first place." The rifle sagged another inch. Eudora studied his face in the thin dawn light, the lines of exhaustion under his eyes, the dust ground into the creases of his hands, and she thought of every rumor that had traveled the valley since Thomas's death, thought of how neatly they had arranged themselves into a story that made sense of her grief. Robert Winslow, jealous of the water, angry over boundary lines, seen near the Ridge Road at the wrong hour. It had felt like truth because it had come wrapped in enough small facts to look whole. "Sheriff Holt has a witness," she said, though her voice had lost its certainty. "Sheriff Holt has a witness who works for Silas Prout," Robert said quietly. "And I would ask you to consider what a man like Prout stands to gain if the Winslows and the Dawsons hate each other enough to sell out cheap and leave this valley for good." She lowered the rifle the rest of the way then, not because she trusted him, not yet, but because the accusation sat strange in her mouth now that she had said it aloud to his face, and because 3 barrels of water sat glistening in the gray morning where no water should have been. "Get off my land, Mr. Winslow," she said, but there was no heat left in it. "I have not decided what I believe, but I have not decided to trust you either." Robert nodded once slow and backed toward his horse without turning away from her, the old habit of a careful man. "I will keep bringing the water," he said. "Believe what you need to about me, but your cows still need to drink and your garden still needs to live through October, and I am not going to let either die on account of a lie I did not tell." He rode off into the pale morning, and Eudora Dawson stood at her fence with her husband's rifle heavy in her hands, watching the dust settle behind him, and for the first time since they had buried Thomas in the little cemetery above the creek, she found herself unsure of exactly what she was grieving. The town of Cedar Hollow sat where the timber came down close to the river, a huddle of clapboard buildings and one brick bank that Silas Prout had built 2 years before with money nobody quite understood the source of. The drought had hit the whole valley hard that summer of 1887, wells failing one after another as the mountain snowpack that fed Elk Creek dwindled to nothing, and every homestead within 20 miles had felt the pinch of thirsty stock and cracked earth. It was common knowledge, though nobody could quite say who had started saying it, that some writer had been hauling water out to the worst-hit families after dark, filling barrels and troughs and moving on before dawn, asking nothing in return. Most families had simply been grateful and had not asked too many questions, because gratitude was easier to hold onto than curiosity when your cattle were staying alive. Eudora had asked, eventually, of Mrs. Patterson at the Mercantile, whether anyone knew who the water rider was, and Mrs. Patterson had lowered her voice and said she'd heard it was one of the Winslow hands, though nobody could say for certain which one, and Eudora had let the matter drop because she had not wanted to think too hard about Winslow generosity while she was still burying her husband and trying to decide if a Winslow's bullet had put him in the ground. Now she knew, and the knowing sat uneasy in her chest for 3 days while she went about her work, delivering Mrs. Alder's 7th child in a cabin that smelled of wood smoke and fear, riding out to check on old man Hutchins' fever, mending the hem of her one good dress by lamplight because there was no money to spare for new cloth in a year like this one. She was 31 years old, widowed 4 months, and she had learned young from her mother, back in Ohio before the family came west, that a woman who knew how to bring life safely into the world would never want for purpose, even in a country as hard as this one. She had not expected, in the middle of that hard purpose, to find herself thinking of Robert Winslow's steady hands and steadier voice more often than she wanted to admit. On the 4th night after the confrontation at her well, she did not go to bed at her usual hour. She sat instead at her kitchen table with the lamp turned low, and when she heard the creak of a wagon axle on the road just past midnight, she pulled a shawl around her shoulders and walked out into the cold dark to meet him. Robert was already lifting a barrel from the wagon bed when he saw her standing at the edge of the lamplight spilling from her open door, and he set the barrel down careful, not startled, as though some part of him had expected this. "You did not have to wait up, Mrs. Dawson," he said. "I wanted to see for myself," she said. "Wanted to see if you were real, or if I dreamed you up out of grief and needing someone to be kind to me." Something moved across his face then, something she would later recognize as the particular ache of a man who had spent a long season being blamed for a thing he had not done, and who had gone on doing right anyway because that was simply who he was. "I am real enough," he said. "Tired mostly. The Elk Creek spring is the last good water left in this end of the valley, and I have been hauling from it near every night since July. How many homesteads? 11, counting yours." Eudora did the arithmetic in her head, the miles between the spring and each of those 11 struggling places, the hours it must take, the sleep he was not getting, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight since Thomas's funeral loosened just slightly. "Why?" she asked again, the same question from before, but gentler this time, wanting a truer answer than the one he had given at the point of her rifle. Robert leaned against the wagon wheel and looked up at the stars, which were sharp and cold and plentiful that night, the way they only were when no cloud stood between the earth and the sky. "My father built our ranch out of nothing, Mrs. Dawson, on land that everyone said would never hold water long enough to run cattle. He proved them wrong through 2 droughts before this one, and he did it by believing that a valley only survives if the folks in it decide to survive it together instead of clawing at each other over what little there is. 2 years back, my own business partner, a man I trusted like a brother, sold half our herd out from under me while I was in Seattle settling my father's estate, and left me holding debts that took me a year and a half to climb out of. I know what it costs a person to be betrayed by someone they trusted. I do not aim to let this valley tear itself apart the same way, not while I have 2 working hands and a wagon." Eudora was quiet for a long moment, the shawl pulled tight against the chill, and then she said, "That does not explain why you keep coming to my well specifically, when half the valley still whispers you killed my husband? No, Robert admitted. It does not. He did not offer more than that, and she did not press him, though something in the admission sat warm in her chest as she walked back inside that night, and she found she slept better than she had in weeks, though she could not have said exactly why. The lie that had framed Robert Winslow had not sprung up on its own, though it would be some weeks yet before Eudora learned the shape of the hand that had planted it. Silas Prout had come to Cedar Hollow 3 years before with money and manners smooth enough to make the town council trust him with the bank charter, and in that time he had quietly bought up notes on half the homesteads in the valley, waiting, the way a patient man waits, for a season bad enough to make those notes come due all at once. The drought of 1887 had been exactly the season he was waiting for, and the only thing standing between Prout and controlling every acre of water-adjacent land in the valley, land that a certain timber and rail concern out of Tacoma had expressed a very serious interest in for a proposed spur line down to the Sound, was the fact that both the Winslow Ranch and the Dawson Homestead held senior water rights on Elk Creek that predated Prout's arrival by a decade. If the Winslows and the Dawsons could be made to hate each other badly enough, if their feud could be made public and bloody enough, then Prout reasoned that both families would eventually sell out of pure exhaustion, and he would be there with cash in hand to buy both parcels at half their worth, then flip the water rights to the rail company for 10 times what he had paid. He had set his plan in motion months before Thomas Dawson died, spreading small rumors, having his hired man Jed Coyle start disputes at the boundary fence, arranging for Winslow cattle to be found grazing on Dawson land and Dawson cattle to be found grazing on Winslow land, each incident small enough to seem like ordinary carelessness, but frequent enough to keep tempers raw. Thomas Dawson's death had not, in fact, been part of Prout's original design. Thomas had stumbled onto Jed Coyle in the act of cutting the Winslow fence line late one night, cutting it in such a way as to let Winslow cattle wander onto Dawson grass and provoke exactly the kind of confrontation Prout wanted. And Thomas, hot-tempered and protective of his land, had confronted Coyle at gunpoint. In the struggle that followed, Coyle's own pistol had discharged and killed Thomas Dawson outright, and Coyle, panicked, had dragged the body to the wash near the Ridge Road and let the valley's gossip do the rest of the work, whispering just enough to just the right people that suspicion fell on Robert Winslow, who had indeed argued with Thomas 3 days before over water allotments, and who had indeed been seen riding the Ridge Road that night, though on his way home from delivering water to the Federley place. Not from any ambush. None of this Eudora knew yet. On the morning she rode into Cedar Hollow to speak with Sheriff Garrett Holt about the case against Robert Winslow, but she carried with her a growing unease that the story she had been told did not sit right against the man she had watched, 3 nights running now, hauling water to homesteads that owed him nothing. Sheriff Holt's office sat between the bank and the mercantile, a low building with a single cell that was more often used to sleep off whiskey than to hold serious criminals, and Holt himself was a heavy-set man in his 50s, who had held the badge for 6 years and had grown, in that time, comfortable enough with Silas Prout's friendship to overlook certain conveniences in how evidence arranged itself. "Mrs. Dawson," Holt said, rising from his desk when she entered, his tone carrying the particular gentleness men reserved for widows, "I am sorry to see you troubled. Is there news from the Winslow place I ought to know?" "I want to know exactly what your witness saw," Eudora said, taking the chair across from his desk without waiting to be invited. "Not what you have concluded from it, what he actually saw with his own eyes." Holt's easy manner flickered just for a moment. "Jed Coyle saw Robert Winslow riding the Ridge Road the night your husband died, Mrs. Dawson, not an hour before Thomas was found. Riding toward town or riding away from it. I believe he said away." "Away from where exactly?" "Away from the wash where my husband was found, or away from the Federley homestead which sits on the same road." Holt shifted in his seat. "I could not say precisely." Then your case against Robert Winslow rests on a man seeing another man ride a public road at night, a road that leads to at least 4 homesteads besides mine, Eudora said. Sheriff, I have delivered half the babies in this valley and set more broken bones than I care to count, and I know the difference between evidence and a story somebody wants told. This is a story. It is the story Jed Coyle gave me under oath, Holt said, his patience thinning. And who is Jed Coyle beholden to for his wages? The sheriff's jaw tightened, and he did not answer, and Eudora took that silence as answer enough. She rose from her chair, smoothed her skirts, and looked down at the man who was supposed to be the valley's keeper of justice. I would ask you to find better evidence before you hang a man on a story told by Silas Pruitt's hired hand, she said, and walked out into the gray autumn light before Holt could think of a reply. Outside the sheriff's office, she found herself standing in the street for a long moment, the cold wind coming down off the mountains carrying the first bite of the season to come, and she realized with something like surprise that she had just spent the better part of 10 minutes defending Robert Winslow to the law. She rode home slowly that afternoon, turning the conversation over in her mind, and when she crested the last rise before her homestead, she found Robert himself in her yard, not delivering water this time, since it was broad daylight, but crouched at her well pump with a wrench in hand. Your pump handle was cracked clean through, he said, glancing up at her without rising. I noticed it 3 nights back and figured I would fix it proper instead of just hauling barrels forever. Found a replacement handle at the mercantile this morning. Eudora dismounted and stood watching him work, the easy competence of his hands, the way he did not make a show of the labor or wait for her thanks. You went to town in daylight, where half the valley could see you, to buy a pump handle for the widow of the man you are accused of killing, she said. I did. That was either very brave or very foolish, Mr. Winslow. He looked up at her then, and there was a dry humor in his eyes that she had not seen from him before. My mother used to say those 2 things were closer cousins than most folks like to admit. Despite herself, Eudora laughed, a short surprised sound that she had not made in what felt like a very long time, and Robert's answering smile was quick and warm, and made something in her chest turn over in a way she was not ready to examine too closely. I spoke to Sheriff Holt this morning, she said, once the moment had passed. I told him his case is built on smoke. Robert's smile faded into something more serious. That was a risk, Mrs. Dawson. Pruitt does not take kindly to folks poking at his arrangements. I have buried a husband and delivered 11 babies since the spring thaw, Mr. Winslow. I am not much frightened of a banker. You should be a little frightened of what a banker can hire, Robert said, and something in his voice had gone low and careful. I do not say that to scare you off from asking questions. I say it because I want you to ask them carefully and maybe not alone. Eudora considered him for a long moment, this man who had first appeared to her at the end of a rifle barrel and now knelt in her yard fixing a well pump he had not broken, defending her honor to a sheriff who had never asked him to. Are you offering to help me prove your own innocence, Mr. Winslow, or are you offering something else? Both, I expect, he said, and turned back to the pump, and she let the conversation end there, though she found herself watching the line of his shoulders as he worked for longer than she meant to. The days that followed brought a strange new rhythm to Eudora's life, one she had not expected and was not entirely sure she was ready for. Robert came by daylight now, no longer hiding his help under cover of darkness, and though the valley gossip took sharp notice of a Winslow spending time at the Dawson place, Eudora found she cared less about that talk than she once might have. He mended fences that Coyle's mischief had damaged. He helped her dig a second well closer to the house, arguing that if Elk Creek continued to shrink through the fall, she would need water that did not depend on any man's charity, his own included. He taught her, one cold afternoon, how to read the particular slant of cloud that meant rain was truly coming versus the false promise of a sky that only threatened, a skill his father had taught him and his father's father before that. In turn, Eudora found herself teaching him things too, showing him which of her garden herbs eased fever and which calmed a nervous stomach, letting him ride along when she went to check on Mrs. Alder's new baby, watching the careful, almost reverent way he held the infant when Mrs. Alders, exhausted and grateful, asked if he would mind holding her while Eudora finished cleaning up. "You are good with her," Eudora observed, watching him from across the small cabin. "I always wanted children," Robert said simply, not looking up from the baby's face. "My marriage did not last long enough to give me any. My wife passed of the fever 4 years back before we had been married 2 years." Eudora had not known this, and something in her chest ached at the plainness with which he said it. No bitterness, only the worn smooth grief of a man who had learned to carry a loss without letting it curdle him. "I am sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago now," he said. "Long enough that the grief has gone quiet most days. But I remember what it is to want a family and lose the chance of it, Mrs. Dawson. And I think that is part of why I could not stand by and watch this valley starve itself over water and pride. Every homestead I have hauled to this summer has a family in it trying to hold on to something. I know what it costs to lose that." Eudora found she had no ready answer to that, only a tightness in her throat that she did not trust herself to speak around. And so she busied herself with her instruments and let the moment pass, though it stayed with her long after they had ridden home that evening in the fading light. It was 2 weeks later, in the second week of October, that the feud Prout had so carefully cultivated finally boiled over into open violence, and it happened in a way that neither Robert nor Eudora had anticipated. Eudora had ridden out before dawn to attend Mrs. Ruiz, whose time had come a full 2 weeks early, and by the time she returned to her own homestead near midday, exhausted but satisfied with a healthy new arrival added to the valley's ledger, she found smoke rising from the direction of the Winslow ranch, black and thick against the pale autumn sky. She did not think. She turned her horse and rode hard toward the smoke, arriving to find Robert's barn engulfed, flames climbing through the old dry timbers with a speed that spoke of dry summer wood and something to help it burn, and Robert himself directing his 2 ranch hands in a desperate line passing buckets from the horse trough, though it was clear even from a distance that the barn itself was beyond saving. "Get the horses out first," Eudora shouted, swinging down from her saddle and running toward the corral gate before anyone could argue with her. And between the 4 of them, they managed to drive the 6 horses, stabled nearest the fire, out into the safety of the open pasture, before the roof beams began to groan and crack. They stood together afterward, coughing smoke from their lungs, watching the barn collapse in on itself in a shower of sparks, and Robert's face in the firelight was tight with a fury Eudora had not seen in him before. "Coil," he said low. "I saw him riding hard away from the ridge not 20 minutes before the smoke started. I would bet my ranch on it being him." "Then we go to Holt," Eudora said. "Holt will say I have no proof, same as he has said about my innocence in your husband's death," Robert said. "A man riding a public road proves nothing, remember. Your own words to the sheriff." The bitterness in his voice was not aimed at her, she understood, but at the maddening unfairness of it, the way the same standard of evidence that had been used to accuse him now failed to serve him when he needed it turned the other direction. "Then we find proof," Eudora said. "Real proof, not another man's word but something that cannot be argued with." Robert looked at her for a long moment, smoke-stained and fierce in the ruined light, and something passed between them that felt less like the wary alliance of 2 people thrown together by circumstance, and more like the beginning of a true partnership. "You keep saying we, Mrs. Dawson," he said quietly. "I have decided," she said, "that if a man is going to be accused of my husband's death and have his barn burned to the ground inside the same season, either he is the unluckiest man in Washington Territory or somebody is working very hard to ruin him, and I would like to know which." "And which do you believe now?" "I believe," Eudora said, and found the words came easier than she expected. That I have not seen you do a single dishonest thing since the morning I pointed a rifle at your chest, and that counts for a great deal more with me than a story told by Silas Pruitt's hired man. Something in Robert's shoulders eased at that, a tension she had not fully registered until it left him, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the ruined barn still smoldering behind them, the ranch hands giving them a wide and tactful berth. "Thank you," Robert said finally, and his voice had gone rough in a way that told her the words meant more to him than their brevity suggested. They began, in the days after the fire, to look for the proof that would clear Robert's name and expose whatever hand was moving behind the valley's troubles. And it was Eudora, with her habit of visiting every homestead in the valley in the course of her work, who first put together the pattern that Robert, too close to his own troubles, had not seen clearly. "Every family whose well went dry this summer," she said one evening, spreading a hand-drawn map of the valley across Robert's kitchen table, the ranch house smelling faintly still of smoke from the barn fire 2 days past, held a note with Pruitt's bank. Every single one. The Federtys, the Alders, the Hutchins place, mine, yours. And every family whose fence has been cut or whose cattle have wandered onto a neighbor's land this season is one of those same families. Robert leaned over the map, tracing the boundary lines with one finger, and she watched understanding dawn slow and then all at once across his face. "He is not just profiting from the drought," Robert said. "He is making it worse, making the feuding worse. So that we will all sell out from exhaustion, and he can buy the water rights cheap and sell them on to the rail company." "That is my thought as well," Eudora said. "But thought is not proof, same as before." Robert was quiet for a long moment, staring at the map. "Pruitt keeps his ledgers at the bank. If he has been paying Coyle to cause trouble, there will be a record of it somewhere, even if he has tried to hide it. Bankers do not trust themselves to remember figures. They write them down. And how do you propose we see inside a locked bank ledger, Mr. Winslow?" "I do not propose we break in, if that is what you are asking," Robert said, a faint smile touching his mouth despite the gravity of the conversation. "I propose we find someone who has legitimate reason to see those books. The territorial bank examiner makes his rounds each fall. If we can get word to him that there is cause for concern, he will look at Pruitt's ledgers as a matter of course, and he will not need our help to find what is hiding in them." It was, Eudora thought, a good plan, careful and lawful in a way that matched the man proposing it, and she found herself smiling at him across the map, a real smile, the first she had given anyone freely since Thomas's death. "You are a careful man, Robert Winslow." "I have learned the cost of not being careful," he said. "Watching a lie nearly cost me my name and my ranch both." The bank examiner, a dry, precise man named Elias Whitfield who traveled a territorial circuit twice a year, was not due in Cedar Hollow for another 3 weeks, and in the meantime the feud that Pruitt had engineered showed no sign of cooling. Twice more, Winslow cattle were found grazing on land that belonged, on paper, to Eudora's late husband's estate, though she now suspected, and Robert agreed, that Coyle himself was driving them there in the night to keep suspicion alive. Twice more small fires were set, one at the edge of the Federley hayfield, one along the fence line separating Winslow and Dawson land, though both were caught and extinguished before real damage was done, thanks in large part to Robert's habit of riding the boundary each night now, rifle across his saddle, watching for exactly this kind of mischief. Eudora offered to ride with him on those night watches, and Robert, true to the caution she had come to know in him, hesitated. "It could turn dangerous," he said. "Coyle is not a man who minds violence if it serves his purpose. I have delivered breech berths in the middle of blizzards, Mr. Winslow, and I have set my own broken wrist when there was nobody else to do it. I do not frighten as easy as you seem to think." "That is not what I meant," Robert said, and there was something almost wounded in his voice. "I do not doubt your courage. I have watched you run into a burning barnyard without a second thought for your own safety. I only meant that I would not forgive myself if something happened to you on my account." Eudora studied him in the lamplight of his kitchen, understanding, not for the first time, the particular shape of his caring, a caring that wanted so badly to shield the people around him that it sometimes forgot to ask them what they wanted for themselves. "Robert," she said, using his given name for the first time, and watching the small flicker of surprise cross his face at the sound of it, "I appreciate that you want to keep me safe, but I am not a piece of glass to be kept on a shelf out of harm's way. I have made my own choices since I was 17 years old and came west with my family, and I buried a husband 4 months ago and kept my homestead running through the worst drought this valley has seen, and I will decide for myself what risks I am willing to take. If you want my help, you will have to trust me to know my own mind." Robert was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again his voice had gone soft. "You are right. I am sorry. It is an old habit, wanting to carry every burden myself so nobody else has to bear the weight of it. My father was the same way, and it cost him friendships he might have kept if he had let people help him more than he let them." "Then let me help," Eudora said. "Not because I am fragile and need protecting, but because I have as much reason as you do to see this feud ended and Silas Prout exposed for what he is." "All right," Robert said, and there was something like relief in his voice, as though he had been waiting, without quite knowing it, for someone to push back against the weight he carried alone. "We ride together then." And so they did, through the cold nights of late October, riding the boundary between the Winslow and Dawson lands, sharing coffee from a battered tin pot warmed over a small fire, talking in low voices about their lives before the drought and the feud had consumed them, about Robert's father who had built the ranch from nothing and died 2 winters back of a weak heart, about Eudora's mother who had taught her midwifery in a soddy on the Kansas plains, before the family pushed on to Washington Territory seeking better land. In those quiet hours, something grew between them that neither one named aloud but both felt clearly, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fires they were watching for, and everything to do with the way Robert's hand sometimes found hers when he passed her the coffee cup, the way Eudora found herself leaning toward him when they sat close against the cold, the way their conversation never seemed to run dry no matter how many nights they spent in each other's company. It was on one such night in the last week of October that Robert finally told her the full truth of what he suspected about her husband's death, a truth he had been holding back, he admitted, out of some misguided instinct to protect her from the pain of it. "I believe Coyle killed Thomas," he said, staring into the small fire between them. "Not on Prout's direct order, I think, but in the course of doing exactly the kind of mischief Prout paid him for. I have thought on it a great deal, and I believe Thomas caught him cutting fence that night, and something went wrong between them, and Coyle has been letting the valley's suspicion fall on me ever since, because it serves Prout's purposes and keeps his own hands clean." Eudora sat very still, the fire crackling between them, and felt the old grief rise up fresh in her chest, tangled now with a cold fury she had not let herself feel before, not truly, because she had spent her grief on sorrow rather than anger. "Why did you not tell me this sooner?" she said, and there was an edge to her voice. "Because I did not want to hand you a fresh wound before I had proof to back it," Robert said. "I did not want you to carry the suspicion of it without something solid to stand on." "That was not your choice to make for me, Robert," Eudora said, and she saw him flinch at the truth of it. "I told you already. I do not need to be protected from hard truths. I need to be trusted with them." "You are right," Robert said again, and this time the words came slower, weighted with real understanding rather than simple apology. "I am learning, Eudora. It does not come easy, unlearning the habit of carrying things alone, but I am trying." She looked at him across the small fire, this man who had first come to her at the point of her own rifle, and had since become something she had not expected to want again in her life, and she found her anger softening into something gentler, though no less honest. "I know you are trying," she said. "That is why I am still here." It was the closest either of them had come to naming what had grown between them, and in the quiet that followed, Robert reached across the small distance separating them and took her hand, not with the careful, protective gentleness he had shown before, but with the plain, honest grip of an equal, and Eudora let him hold it, and neither of them said anything more that night, though the silence between them had changed into something warm and full of promise. The first snow came early that year, in the first week of November, catching the valley by surprise the way it sometimes did in that country, where the mountains held their own weather close and let it spill down into the lowlands without much warning. Eudora woke to find her windows rimmed with frost and a thin white blanket already settled over her yard, and she thought, with a small pang of worry, of the bank examiner Elias Whitfield, who was due to arrive in Cedar Hollow within the week, and of the state of the roads that would carry him there. She thought, too, of Sarah McAllister, a young woman not yet 20 who lived on the far side of Elk Creek with her husband on a homestead they had claimed only that spring, and who was, by Eudora's careful reckoning, no more than a week or two from her time. The McAllisters were newcomers to the valley, having come out from Ohio only that past summer with more hope than experience, and Eudora had visited Sarah twice already, finding her healthy but nervous, unused to the isolation of frontier life and frightened, in the plain way of a young woman facing her first childbirth far from her own mother. The trouble was the creek itself, and the narrow plank bridge that spanned the ravine where Elk Creek ran fast and deep in its lower stretch before widening out toward the valley floor. It was the only crossing for 6 miles in either direction, and it had never been a sturdy structure even in good weather, built hastily by the valley's first settlers a decade before, and patched since then with whatever lumber came to hand. Word reached Eudora on the third day of snow, carried by a breathless boy on a lathered pony, that the McAllister baby had decided to come early after all, 2 weeks ahead of Eudora's reckoning, and that Sarah's husband had ridden for the doctor in Cedar Hollow only to find the doctor already committed to a broken leg case at the logging camp up the mountain, and that Sarah herself was asking, through her pain, for the midwife who had visited her twice before and made her feel less afraid. "The bridge, ma'am," the boy said, still catching his breath. "Mr. Holly says the bridge is bad. Says the snow melted funny on the high ground and the creek came up sudden in the night and took out 2 of the support beams. Says nobody ought to cross it right now, not with wagons, maybe not even a horse." Eudora was already moving, pulling her coat from its peg, gathering her birthing bag with the swift efficiency of long practice. "How many folks are stranded on the near side?" she asked. "Near a dozen, ma'am. Mr. Holly's and his family were coming back from visiting his sister in town, and there's 2 freight wagons besides, and a family passing through on their way to file a claim up the valley. They all got caught out when the bridge went, and can't get back or forward." Eudora saddled her horse in a matter of minutes and rode hard for the Winslow ranch, arriving breathless and windblown to find Robert already outside, checking the latches on his barn doors against the weather. "The bridge over Elk Creek is out," she said without preamble, "and Sarah McAllister is in labor on the far side of it, and there are a dozen travelers stranded at the near bank who need to get across or back to shelter before this snow gets worse." Robert's face went sharp with focus in the way she had come to recognize as his particular gift, the quick, calm assessment of a crisis that came from a lifetime of ranch work where hesitation cost lives. "I have lumber in the barn left from the old hay shed we tore down in the spring," he said. "Sound planks, good and thick. If Hollies and the other travelers can help hold torches and steady the work, I believe we can shore up those support beams enough to get a person across safely, maybe even a light wagon, though I would not trust it with anything heavier." "Then let us go," Eudora said, and something in the plain partnership of the moment, the way neither of them wasted time arguing about who should do what, warmed her even through the cold. They rode for the bridge together, Robert's wagon loaded with lumber and rope and tools, Eudora's horse laden with her birthing bag and extra blankets, and they arrived to find the scene much as the boy had described, A huddle of cold, frightened travelers gathered on the near bank around two small fires, the bridge itself sagging visibly in the middle where the support beams had given way, the creek below running high and fast and dark with snowmelt. Mr. Hollies, a broad, weathered man Eudora recognized from church socials in town, met them at the fire with obvious relief. "Mrs. Dawson, Mr. Winslow, thank God. We did not know what to do. The Prout family maintains this bridge under the county contract, and I sent a man to fetch help from town 2 hours back, but no word yet." "Prout maintains the bridge," Robert repeated, something dark crossing his face, and Eudora understood the implication as quickly as he did, that a bridge left to rot under the care of a man who profited from the valley's isolation and desperation was no accident at all, but she pushed the thought aside for now, because there was work to do that could not wait for justice. "We do not have time to wait on help from town," Eudora said. "Mr. Hollies, I need every able hand you have to help hold torches and steady lumber. Mr. Winslow, tell me what you need." What followed was 2 hours of the hardest, most careful work Eudora had ever watched, Robert wading into the icy shallows at the bridge's edge, guided by rope tied around his waist and held by 2 of the freight wagon drivers, to assess exactly where the support beams had failed, while Eudora organized the stranded travelers into a system of relay, passing lumber and tools hand to hand down to the water's edge, keeping the 2 small fires fed and bright against the gathering dark and the thickening snow. "There," Robert called up, pointing to the 2 beams that had cracked and shifted. "If we can brace these with the new lumber and lash it tight, I believe the span will hold, at least enough for a person on foot or leading a horse." The work of bracing the beams in the freezing water was brutal, and Robert's hands, when he finally climbed back up the bank after the first hour, were blue with cold despite the gloves Eudora had insisted he wear, and she took them between her own without thinking, chafing warmth back into his fingers while he stood shivering and grateful in the firelight. "You cannot go back in there again without warming up first," she said, "or you will be no good to anyone frozen through. Sarah McAllister does not have time for me to sit by the fire and warm my hands, Eudora," Robert said, though he did not pull away from her grip. "Sarah McAllister needs you alive and capable, not frozen and useless in the middle of the creek," Eudora shot back, and there was enough of the old widow's practicality in her tone that Robert managed a tired laugh. "You argue like my mother used to," he said. "Good," Eudora said. "Your mother sounds like she had sense." She rubbed warmth into his hands for another few minutes, refusing to let him back down the bank until his shivering had eased, and in that small enforced pause, with the snow falling thick around them and the fire crackling close, Robert looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something unguarded and full of feeling that made her breath catch. "Thank you," he said, "for making me stop and be warmed, even when I did not want to." "That is what partnership looks like, Robert," she said softly. "Sometimes it means telling the other person no, even when they think they know better." He nodded, slow, and something passed between them in that moment, wordless and certain, before he turned and went back down to finish the work. By the time the last beam was lashed and braced, full dark had fallen, and the snow had thickened into a steady curtain that made the torchlight strange and golden against the white ground. Robert tested the repaired span himself first, walking its length with careful, measured steps, feeling for any give in the wood, and when he reached the far side and turned back to wave them across, a small cheer went up from the gathered travelers that Eudora felt in her own chest like a burst of warmth against the cold. "It will hold for foot and horse traffic," Robert called back across the span, "but nothing heavier until proper repairs can be made in the spring. Mrs. Dawson, come across, and I will guide your horse behind you." Eudora crossed the bridge with her heart in her throat despite Robert's careful testing, feeling the boards flex slightly beneath her boots, hearing the creek roaring dark and fast below, and when she reached the far side Robert's hand closed around hers to steady her the last few steps, warm now despite the cold, and she did not let go of it even once she stood safely on solid ground. "The McAllister place is another 2 miles up this road," Robert said. "I will come with you." "It is no night to ride alone. I would not ask you to leave the bridge unwatched," Eudora said, though she was grateful for the offer. "Hollies and the others can manage the crossing from here, now that the way is safe," Robert said. "I am not leaving you to ride 2 miles alone in a snowstorm to deliver a baby, Eudora. Not tonight, not any night." There was something fierce in the way he said it, and Eudora, who had spent so many months now insisting on her own capability, found she did not mind, this time, the plain devotion behind his words, because it did not come from a place of doubting her but simply from a place of not wanting to be apart from her in a night full of danger. They rode the last 2 miles together through the falling snow, arriving at the McAllister homestead to find young Sarah deep in the hardest part of her labor, her husband white-faced and useless with fear at her bedside, and Eudora went to work with the swift, sure competence that had carried her through 11 births that summer alone, while Robert, without being asked, built up the fire, boiled water, and kept Sarah's husband occupied fetching and carrying so that the young man's nervous energy did not add to his wife's distress. The baby, a healthy girl with a full head of dark hair, arrived just before midnight, squalling loud and strong into the cold night, and Eudora placed her in Sarah's exhausted, joyful arms with the particular satisfaction that never grew old no matter how many times she witnessed it, the moment when fear gave way entirely to wonder. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, tears streaking her tired face. "Thank you for coming, even with the bridge and the storm and everything." "That is what I am here for," Eudora said, and found Robert watching her from across the small cabin with an expression of such open admiration that she felt her own cheeks warm despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. They rode back toward the bridge in the deep hours of the night, the snow still falling but gentler now, the world hushed and white around them, and Robert reined his horse in close to hers as they rode, close enough that their legs nearly brushed. "I have watched you do a great many things since the morning you pointed a rifle at me, Eudora Dawson," he said, "but I do not think I have ever admired you more than I did tonight, watching you bring that child into the world with such steady hands, after a night that would have broken most people's nerve entirely. You built a bridge across a flooded creek in the freezing dark to make it possible," Eudora said. "I do not think you give yourself enough credit, Robert Winslow." "Perhaps we ought to give each other credit then," he said, and there was something in his voice, low and warm despite the cold, that made her heart beat faster. They crossed the repaired bridge together in the last hour before dawn, and on the near side, with the stranded travelers finally settled safely for what remained of the night in Hollies' barn, and the fires burned down to embers, Robert helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary, and Eudora found she did not want to step back from him. "Eudora," he said, her name rough and careful in his mouth, "I have tried very hard these past weeks not to presume more than you have offered me. But I find I cannot ride away from you tonight without telling you that I have come to care for you a great deal, more than I know what to do with, if I am honest, and I would like very much to kiss you, if you would allow it." The snow had stopped falling entirely now, and the world around them was hushed in silver in the last hour before dawn, and Eudora looked up at this man who had carried water to her failing homestead through a whole summer of drought before she had ever known his name, who had built a bridge in a snowstorm to bring her safely to a frightened young mother, who had learned, slowly and honestly, to trust her judgment as much as his own. "I would allow it," she said softly, "very gladly." He kissed her then, gentle at first, careful in the way he was careful about everything that mattered to him, and when she leaned into it, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, he deepened the kiss with a tenderness that made her feel, for the first time in a long while, entirely and safely wanted. When they finally broke apart, both a little breathless, Robert rested his forehead against hers and let out a long, unsteady breath. I have wanted to do that since the night you first waited up for my wagon, he admitted. I have wanted you to do that since you fixed my well pump and would not take credit for it, Eudora said, and felt him laugh softly against her. They rode home separately that dawn, each to their own land. But something had settled between them that neither the coming winter nor the trouble still brewing with Silas Prout could unsettle now. A certainty that had been building quietly through every shared fire and every hard-won trust since the morning of the rifle. Elias Whitfield, the territorial bank examiner, arrived in Cedar Hollow 4 days later, delayed slightly by the snow but otherwise unbothered. A small, precise man with wire spectacles, and a manner that suggested he had seen every variety of financial mischief the frontier had to offer and was rarely surprised by any of it. Robert had sent word ahead through a rancher friend with connections in the territorial capital, explaining enough of the valley's troubles to ensure Whitfield would give the Cedar Hollow bank's books a closer look than a routine visit usually warranted. What Whitfield found, after 2 days of careful review conducted with Sheriff Holt present, whether the sheriff liked it or not, was damning enough to end Silas Prout's schemes in the valley entirely. The ledgers showed regular payments to Jed Coyle disguised as wages for ranch work Coyle had never actually performed, payments that lined up precisely with the dates of the cut fences, the wandering cattle, and the fire at the Federley hayfield. More damning still, a separate ledger, kept carelessly in a locked drawer Prout had not expected anyone to search, showed correspondence with the Pacific Timber and Rail Company detailing Prout's intention to acquire the water rights along Elk Creek at the lowest possible price, and resell them at enormous profit, once the rail company's survey confirmed the route. Confronted with the evidence, Jed Coyle, facing the prospect of hanging for Thomas Dawson's death if he did not cooperate, confessed the full truth to Sheriff Holt, admitting that he had been cutting the Winslow fence line on Prout's orders when Thomas Dawson caught him, and that Thomas's death had been an accident born of panic rather than deliberate murder, though Coyle had let the valley's suspicion fall on Robert Winslow ever since because it served his employer's purposes. Silas Prout did not go quietly. When Sheriff Holt and 2 deputized ranchers arrived at the bank to arrest him, Prout attempted to flee out the back entrance toward the stable, only to find Robert Winslow waiting there, having anticipated exactly this possibility and positioned himself accordingly. "Going somewhere, Mr. Prout?" Robert asked, standing calm and immovable in the stable doorway, no weapon drawn, simply his presence enough to give the banker pause. "You have ruined everything," Prout spat, his composure finally cracking after years of careful, cold manipulation. "That valley would have been worth nothing without the rail line. I was going to make something of it." "You were going to make something of it for yourself," Robert said, "at the cost of good families who had already given everything they had to that land. Thomas Dawson gave his life for your scheme, Mr. Prout, and you let his widow believe I was the one who took him from her. That is not building something. That is destroying everything decent this valley had left." Prout made one last desperate lunge for the stable's side door, but Robert caught him easily, holding him firm until Sheriff Holt arrived to take him into custody, and whatever grudging friendship had existed between Holt and Prout evaporated entirely in the face of the evidence Whitfield had uncovered. Prout was held in the town's small jail to await transport to the territorial court in Olympia, where he would eventually be convicted of fraud, conspiracy, and accessory charges related to Thomas Dawson's death, though Coyle, as the one whose hand had actually fired the fatal shot, faced the more serious charge of manslaughter and would serve a lengthy sentence in the territorial prison. Eudora received the news of Prout's arrest and Coyle's confession from Robert himself, who rode to her homestead the moment the matter was settled, finding her in her garden gathering the last of the season's hardy vegetables before the ground froze solid. "It is over," he said simply, dismounting and crossing the yard to where she stood, her hands still dirty from the earth, her breath fogging in the cold air. "Coyle confessed everything. Prout is under arrest. Sheriff Holt has cleared my name formally in front of witnesses, and the whole valley will know the truth of what happened to Thomas by tomorrow." Eudora set down her basket and stood very still for a moment, absorbing the weight of it, the long months of grief and suspicion and slow-building trust finally resolving into plain, clear truth. "He did not mean to die over a cut fence," she said quietly, and Robert understood she meant Thomas. "No," he said gently. "It was an accident born of Coyle's cowardice and Prout's greed. Thomas died trying to protect what was his, same as any of us would have. There is no shame in that, Eudora, only grief, and I am sorry you have had to carry it without the truth for so long." Eudora nodded, tears standing in her eyes now, grief and relief mingling in a way that left her feeling both lighter and more tender than she had in months. Robert stepped closer and gathered her into his arms, and she let herself be held, let herself cry for Thomas properly for the first time since the funeral, no longer burdened by suspicion or uncertainty, only by honest sorrow for a man who had died trying to do right by his own land. "Thank you," she said finally into his shoulder, "for not giving up on proving the truth, even when the whole valley was ready to believe the easy lie." "I could not have done it without you," Robert said. "You are the one who saw the pattern nobody else noticed. You are the one who pushed Sheriff Holt when nobody else dared. I only helped." "We did it together," Eudora said, pulling back to look up at him. "Same as we did the bridge and the water and everything else since the morning I pointed a rifle at your chest." Robert smiled at that, the tension of the past months finally easing fully from his shoulders. "I do not think I will ever quite forget how you looked, standing at your fence with that Winchester leveled at me, fierce as anything I had ever seen. I do not think I will ever quite forget how calm you stayed, with a rifle pointed at your heart," Eudora said. "You did not even flinch." "I had already decided," Robert said, "that if I was going to die that morning, at least I would die having tried to do right by my neighbors first. It seemed as good a way to go as any." Eudora laughed despite the tears still drying on her cheeks, and Robert kissed her forehead, gentle and warm, and for a long moment they simply stood together in the cold garden, the danger and suspicion of the past months finally, truly behind them. The valley settled, in the weeks that followed, into a kind of cautious peace that it had not known since before the drought had begun. With Prout's bank placed under territorial receivership and honest management, installed to sort through the tangle of debts and notes he had accumulated, many of the homesteaders found their loans renegotiated fairly for the first time in years, no longer weighted with the deliberate cruelty Prout had built into the terms. The Pacific Timber and Rail Company, informed by the territorial authorities of the fraud that had underpinned Prout's dealings, quietly withdrew its interest in the Elk Creek route, choosing instead to survey a different valley entirely, one without the taint of scandal now attached to this one. Robert rebuilt his barn through the early weeks of winter, the whole valley turning out to help in the old frontier tradition of a barn raising. Families who had once eyed each other with suspicion, now working side by side, passing lumber and nails and casseroles with the easy camaraderie that had been Robert's whole aim from the very first night. He had loaded water barrels onto his wagon back in July. Eudora brought food for the workers and mended more than one scraped hand in the course of the day's labor, and by evening the new barn stood raised and solid against the winter sky, a fitting symbol, everyone agreed, of a valley putting itself back together. It was in December, with the first heavy snows of true winter settling over the valley and Elk Creek, running quiet and frozen beneath its banks, that Robert came to Eudora's homestead one evening with a particular seriousness in his manner that told her something important was coming. They sat together at her kitchen table, the fire crackling warm against the cold outside, and Robert took her hands in his thumbs tracing gentle circles over her knuckles in a way that had become familiar and dear to her over the past months. "Eudora," he said, "I have thought long about what I want to say to you tonight, and I find that plain words serve me best, same as they always have. I love you. I have loved you, I think, since the night you waited up in the dark to see if I was real, and every day since has only deepened that love into something I do not ever want to be without. I would like to ask you to marry me, and to build a life together on whichever land makes the most sense for both our purposes, whether that is my ranch or your homestead or some new arrangement we build between the two of us. Eudora felt her heart swell with a joy she had not expected to feel again so fully after Thomas's death, and yet here it was, real and warm and entirely her own to claim. "I love you too, Robert Winslow," she said, "and I would be glad to marry you. But I want to say plainly, before I answer fully, that I will not give up my work. The women of this valley need a midwife, and I have built something of my own in that work that I am not willing to set aside, not even for love." "I would never ask you to," Robert said, and the sincerity in his voice left no room for doubt. "I fell in love with a woman who runs toward burning barns and rides through snowstorms to deliver babies, Eudora. I would not want you to become anything less than exactly who you are." "Then yes," Eudora said, her voice thick with feeling, "I will marry you." They were married in the small Cedar Hollow church in the first week of January, 1888, in a ceremony attended by nearly the whole valley. The same neighbors who had once whispered accusations against Robert now gathered to celebrate the union of two people whose love had grown out of drought and grief into something sturdy and true. Sarah McAllister attended with her infant daughter, now 2 months old and thriving, and Mrs. Alders brought her youngest, the child Eudora had delivered in the depths of that hard summer, and the church was full of the particular warmth that comes from a community that has weathered hardship together and come through it stronger. They settled in the end at the Winslow Ranch, since it offered more room for the cattle Robert was slowly rebuilding and better shelter through the harsh mountain winters. But Eudora kept her own homestead as well, renting it to a young couple newly arrived in the valley who needed a start. And she continued her midwifery practice from the Winslow Ranch just as she always had, riding out whenever she was called, Robert often accompanying her on the longer or more difficult journeys, though he had learned fully now to ask rather than assume, to offer his help rather than insist upon it. In the spring that followed, when the snow finally cleared from the high passes and Elk Creek ran fast and clean with the mountain melt, the valley's homesteaders came together to build a proper bridge across the ravine, a sturdy structure of good timber and stone footings that would not fail again with the first hard rain. And Robert Winslow, who had once carried water alone through the darkest hours of a desperate summer, stood among his neighbors as an equal partner in the work. No longer burdened by suspicion or grief, but simply and fully himself, a man who had earned, through patience and honesty and quiet devotion, the love of a woman as capable and courageous as he was. Eudora Dawson Winslow, watching the new bridge take shape from the same bank where she had once crossed a broken span in the dark to bring a frightened young mother safely through her first childbirth, felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who had built her own life on her own terms, who had found in Robert not a man who wished to decide her path for her, but a partner who walked it beside her, steady and true. Exactly as he had promised on that first cold morning when she had lowered her rifle and let herself, slowly and carefully, begin to trust again. That evening, as the sun set gold and warm over the valley for the first time in what felt like a very long while, Robert found her sitting on the porch of their ranch house, watching the light fade over the mountains, and he sat down beside her, taking her hand in his the way he always did now, easy and certain. "Do you ever think about that morning," he asked, "when you had that rifle pointed at me?" "Every day," Eudora said, smiling. "It reminds me how close I came to never knowing you at all, and how grateful I am that you did not run when I asked you to leave." "I could not have run from you even if I had wanted to," Robert said. "I think some part of me knew, even then, that you were exactly the kind of trouble worth staying for." Eudora laughed, leaning into his shoulder as the last light faded from the sky, and Robert wrapped his arm around her, and they sat together in comfortable silence. Two people who had found, in the hardest season either of them had known, a love strong enough to carry them through drought and grief and danger into a life built honestly together, on ground they had both fought hard to keep. The valley healed in time, the way valleys do, the scars of that hard summer fading beneath new grass and new trust, and the story of the rancher who had carried water to every failing homestead, and the widow who had once aimed a rifle at his heart became, in the years that followed, one of the stories the valley told most fondly, a reminder to every new family that came seeking a start in that hard, beautiful country, that even the driest season eventually gives way to rain. And even the deepest suspicion can soften, given time and truth, and a steady hand extended in good faith, into something as lasting and warm as love itself.